Thomas Reed almost dropped his coffee mug when he opened the fancy envelope that was stuck to his front door. Inside was a wedding invitation, but not just any wedding invitation. This one listed his own house and garden as the place where two strangers would be getting married next month. "What the hell is this?" he said out loud even though no one was around to hear him. "Before you watch full story, comment down your country name, I would love to hear." The invitation, printed on thick cream paper with shiny gold letters, announced that Sarah Bennett and Michael Cooper would be celebrating their wedding at Reed Gardens on June 15th, just 4 weeks away. Thomas had never heard of these people before. Thomas, 40 years old and recently back in his hometown of Oakville, stared at the invitation in disbelief. 6 months ago, his grandmother Rose had passed away, leaving him her beautiful old Victorian house with its famous flower gardens. The 5-acre property stood at the edge of Oakville Heights, an expensive neighborhood with strict rules run by a powerful homeowners association. Without wasting any time, Thomas called the phone number printed at the bottom of the invitation. After 3 rings, a cheerful woman answered. "Bennett Cooper Wedding, Sarah speaking." "Hello, this is Thomas Reed," he said, trying to stay calm. "I just found your wedding invitation on my door. There's a big problem here. You've listed my private home as your wedding location." There was a short pause. "Oh, you must be calling about the parking arrangements," Sarah said. "Don't worry, we've told all our guests to park along Pine Street so they won't block your driveway." Thomas took a deep breath. "No, that's not why I'm calling. I'm calling because you cannot have your wedding at my house. I never gave anyone permission to use my property for a wedding." Sarah's friendly voice suddenly turned cold. "What? That's ridiculous. I paid $4,000 to the Oakville Historical Society months ago for the venue fee. Reed Gardens is listed as an official venue on their website." "My house is not a venue for rent," Thomas said firmly. "It's my private home." "Well, I have a signed contract that says otherwise," Sarah snapped. "I suggest you talk to Barbara Wilson at the HOA. I have 180 guests coming in 4 weeks, many traveling from across the country. That venue will be ready." Before Thomas could say anything else, she hung up. Thomas immediately went online and searched for Oakville Historical Society wedding venues. What he found made his blood boil. There was a professional-looking website showing several historic venues for your special day in Oakville. And there, front and center, was his grandmother's house, listed as Reed Gardens, Victorian elegance for your perfect wedding. The site showed recent photos of his property, clearly taken without his knowledge, and listed rental fees starting at $4,000. The contact person was Barbara Wilson, president of the Oakville Heights HOA. Thomas remembered meeting Barbara shortly after moving in. She had come to his door carrying a thick folder of neighborhood rules, insisting they applied to his property. He had politely explained that his grandmother's land wasn't part of the HOA and had nothing to do with their rules. Barbara had left with a tight smile that day, but apparently she hadn't accepted his answer. Grabbing his car keys, Thomas drove straight to the HOA office, a small brick building in the center of Oakville Heights. Inside, a young receptionist greeted him with a practiced smile. "I need to speak with Barbara Wilson immediately," Thomas said firmly. "Do you have an appointment?" the receptionist asked. "Mrs. Wilson is very busy with the summer events committee this morning." Thomas leaned forward. "Tell her Thomas Reed is here about the unauthorized use of his property as a wedding venue. I'll wait." 10 minutes later, he was shown into a meeting room where Barbara Wilson sat at the head of a table with 4 other people. Barbara was around 55 with perfectly styled blonde hair, wearing an expensive blue dress and pearl necklace. "Mr. Reed," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What seems to be the problem?" "The problem, Mrs. Wilson," Thomas replied evenly, "is that you're advertising my property as a wedding venue without my permission, taking money for bookings, and allowing strangers to plan events on my private land." The room fell silent. Barbara's fake smile remained in place. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said smoothly. "Your property was added to our historical venues program last year. Your grandmother signed the agreement herself." She nodded to a man sitting beside her, who slid a document across the table. Thomas picked it up and immediately spotted his grandmother's signature at the bottom. The date showed it had been signed just 3 months before her death. "This signature is fake," Thomas said, placing the paper back on the table. "My grandmother was in the hospital during this time. She was too weak to even hold a pen, let alone sign legal documents. And she would never have agreed to this. She specifically bought this property because it was outside HOA boundaries." "That's quite an accusation, Mr. Reed," Barbara said, her smile hardening. The agreement is perfectly legal, witnessed by 2 board members. Your grandmother understood that maintaining a historic property requires community support. A woman sitting next to Barbara nodded eagerly. The Historical Venues program helps preserve Oakville's character while generating maintenance funds. It's really in everyone's best interest. The arrangement specifies that 60% of booking fees go toward property upkeep, she added, as if this made everything okay. I haven't received a single penny for property upkeep, Thomas countered. Where has all this money been going? The uncomfortable glances exchanged around the table told him everything he needed to know. Barbara cleared her throat. There's a reserve fund established, of course. We were planning to approach you about necessary improvements once you'd settled in. How many weddings have you scheduled at my property? Thomas asked quietly. Just 3 this season, another board member quickly said. The Bennett Cooper wedding next month and 2 more in July and August. All very tasteful events, I assure you. Thomas stood up. I'll be speaking with my lawyer about this immediately. In the meantime, I suggest you start calling these people to explain that you've been selling access to property you don't own. As he turned to leave, Barbara's voice stopped him at the door. Mr. Reed, I strongly advise against making this difficult. Oakville Heights represents over 250 homeowners with significant influence in this community. The Historical Venues program has been very popular, bringing tourism dollars to local businesses. Thomas turned back slowly. Is that a threat, Mrs. Wilson? Her smile returned. Simply a statement of fact. Sometimes it's better to be a team player. Thomas drove straight to the office of John Davidson, his grandmother's longtime attorney. The older lawyer listened with growing anger as Thomas explained the situation. This is outrageous, John said, examining the photo of the forged agreement on Thomas's phone. Rose would never have agreed to this. She valued her privacy and her gardens. And this isn't even a good forgery, look at the R.N. Reed. Your grandmother's handwriting was very distinctive. John promised to send a cease and desist letter immediately, but his expression remained worried. Barbara Wilson has a lot of power in this town, Thomas. Her husband is on the city council, her brother owns the local newspaper, and the HOA influences many local businesses. This won't be a simple legal issue, it's going to get political. Thomas nodded, already suspecting as much from Barbara's veiled threat. What do they really want from this? Even with multiple weddings, we're talking about what, $30,000 a year in venue fees? That seems like a small amount for the risk they're taking. John leaned back in his chair. I suspect this is about more than money. Your grandmother's property is the last large piece of land in that area not under HOA control. It's 5 acres of valuable real estate surrounded by increasingly crowded development. My guess is the venue program is just the first step in establishing some form of control over the property. He pulled out a thick folder from his filing cabinet. Rose suspected something like this might happen. She asked me to give you this if there were ever any challenges to the property's independence. Inside were land surveys, original deeds, and documentation showing that his grandmother had repeatedly rejected offers from developers and the HOA to buy or take over her land. Most interesting was a letter from the city dated just a year before her death, confirming that attempts to rezone the property had been rejected. She knew they'd come after it, Thomas said quietly. John nodded. Rose was nobody's fool. She left you not just the property but the ammunition to defend it. On the drive home, Thomas considered his options. A cease and desist letter would establish his legal position, but it wouldn't solve the immediate problem of the Bennett Cooper wedding scheduled in just 4 weeks. Something told him Barbara Wilson wasn't going to back down easily. That evening, as Thomas sat on his porch thinking, an old green pickup truck pulled into his driveway. A tall, thin man in his 70s stepped out and walked toward the house with the easy stride of someone who had spent a lifetime working outdoors. You must be Rose's grandson, the man called. I'm Jack Thompson. I used to take care of the gardens for your grandmother. Thomas invited him to sit on the porch. Nice to meet you, Mr. Thompson. I've been meaning to call about hiring help with the gardens. Jack settled into a chair. Heard you're having trouble with Barbara Wilson and her HOA crowd. News traveled fast in small towns. Word gets around, Thomas said with a wry smile. Your grandmother would be furious if she knew what they were trying to pull, Jack said, shaking his head. Been watching them circle this place like vultures for years. What do you know about this Historical Venues program? Thomas asked. Jack snorted. It started legitimate enough. A few old buildings in town whose owners agreed to open them for tours and events. But as it got more profitable, they started adding properties without proper permission. always with the same excuse about preserving community character, while generating funds that seem to disappear into administrative costs. He leaned forward. Most folks are too intimidated to fight back. Barbara's husband can make life difficult for local businesses through selective enforcement of city codes. Her social circle includes every influential person in town. So what would you suggest I do about the wedding scheduled here in a month? Thomas asked. Jack's eyes twinkled. Well, seems to me you've got 3 options. 1. You go along with it, let them hold their wedding and fight the larger battle later. 2. You get your lawyer to shut it down, deal with the fallout from a disappointed bride and her 180 guests. Or 3, he paused, you find a creative way to make sure nobody wants to have their fancy wedding here. Thomas raised an eyebrow. What did you have in mind? Jack chuckled. Your grandmother always said, sometimes the best way to deal with unreasonable people is to be spectacularly unreasonable yourself. Make it memorable. Over the next hour, as the sun set over the gardens, they formed a plan. The next morning brought a response to the cease and desist letter, not from Barbara directly but from the HOA's attorney. The carefully worded document acknowledged Thomas's ownership while insisting that the historical venue's agreement was binding due to his grandmother's signature. It suggested that any disruption to planned events would result in legal action for breach of contract and damages. John called to discuss next steps, but Thomas already had a plan. Hold off on responding, he told his lawyer. I have an idea that might solve this problem more effectively than a legal battle. Thomas spent the next days making preparations, contacting local businesses not tied to the HOA, and gathering information about Sarah Bennett and her fiancé Michael Cooper. Social media revealed Sarah was a real estate agent working for the same company that handled most of Oakville Heights property sales. Michael was the son of a developer whose company had built the newest section of the HOA community. The connections were becoming clearer. This wasn't just any wedding. It was a social and business alliance between families deeply embedded in Barbara's power structure. No wonder she was so determined to make it happen. By the end of the week, Thomas had everything he needed for what his grandmother would have called a strategic demonstration of consequences. The Saturday before the scheduled wedding, precisely at 7:30 in the morning, just late enough to be legal under the town's noise ordinance but early enough to ensure maximum attention, 3 large trucks rumbled up his driveway. The first carried a portable toilet company, whose workers began placing 15 bright blue portable toilets in a neat row across his front lawn. The second truck brought a pest control company whose employees started posting large yellow warning, pest treatment in progress signs all around the property. The third and most impressive was from Johnson's Demolition and Excavation, complete with a small bulldozer on a trailer. Thomas had warned his immediate neighbors about the commotion, explaining truthfully that he was undertaking significant landscape renovations. Most were sympathetic once they heard about the HOA's scheme. As workers in bright yellow vests moved across his property, Thomas noticed curtains twitching in several Oakville Heights homes visible from his backyard. It took less than 30 minutes for curious onlookers to gather on the sidewalk, and exactly 45 minutes for a shiny black luxury car to come screeching into his driveway. Barbara Wilson emerged like a storm cloud in human form, designer sunglasses pushed up into her perfectly styled hair, wearing what appeared to be tennis clothes. What is the meaning of this? She demanded, gesturing wildly at the activity around them. Thomas smiled pleasantly, clipboard in hand. Good morning, Barbara. Just getting the property ready for some major renovations. The entire backyard is being redesigned, new drainage, excavation for a pond, complete replanting. He gestured to the bulldozer being unloaded. We're starting on Monday morning bright and early. Barbara's face showed confusion, then disbelief and finally horror. Monday? You can't possibly be serious. The Bennett Cooper wedding is next Saturday. Thomas affected a look of innocent confusion. Wedding? Oh, you must be referring to the event you scheduled on my property without permission. Yes, I suppose this would interfere with that, wouldn't it? He tapped his chin thoughtfully. Terrible timing, but since I never agreed to host any wedding, and since this is my private property, I'm free to make whatever improvements I see fit. He waved toward the portable toilets. Those are for the work crew, by the way. They'll be here for at least 3 weeks. As if on cue, Sarah Bennett's car pulled in behind Barbara's. The bride-to-be jumped out with her phone in her hand. What is happening here? She cried, taking in the portable toilets and pest control signs with visible distress. I just got calls from 3 different neighbors. Barbara turned to her, struggling to maintain composure. Sarah, darling, there's been a slight misunderstanding with Mr. Reed about the historical venues program. I'm sure we can work something out. She turned back to Thomas, lowering her voice. Be reasonable, Thomas. We can discuss compensation or perhaps some sort of compromise. Thomas shook his head. There's no misunderstanding, Barbara. You forged my grandmother's signature and have been selling access to my property without permission. I've decided that rather than pursue legal action for fraud, trespassing, and misrepresentation, I'll simply exercise my right to improve my property however I see fit. He turned to Sarah, whose mascara was beginning to run as tears welled in her eyes. Miss Bennett, I'm truly sorry that you've been caught in the middle of this. You should know that Barbara never had the right to offer my property as a venue. Whatever money you paid was taken under false pretenses. Sarah turned to Barbara, confusion giving way to anger. You told me everything was arranged. You said the new owner had honored all existing bookings. Barbara's composure cracked further. It's a simple miscommunication. Mr. Reed is being difficult about a technicality. Forgery isn't a technicality, Barbara, Thomas interrupted calmly. Neither is fraud. He showed Sarah the forged document with his grandmother's signature. This was supposedly signed when my grandmother was in the hospital, barely conscious. The HOA has been taking venue fees without my knowledge or consent. Sarah's face paled as the implications hit her. I paid $4,000 for this venue. The rentals, the catering, the flowers, everything is designed around this garden setting. Where am I supposed to find another location in a week? Her voice rose with each word, drawing the attention of workers and onlookers. Barbara grabbed Sarah's arm, trying to steer her away. Let's discuss this privately. I'm sure we can find an alternative. But Sarah shook her off, years of wedding planning stress focusing into anger directed squarely at Barbara Wilson. You promised me the most beautiful venue in Oakville. You showed me the pictures. You handled everything. And now you're telling me it was all based on a lie. Sarah was now shouting, her voice carrying clearly to the neighbors gathered at the edge of the property. 180 guests, Barbara. Some flying in from California. Where are they supposed to go? Thomas stepped back, allowing the scene to unfold. More cars arrived. Sarah's mother, her wedding planner, and several friends drawn by frantic text messages. The quiet Saturday morning had transformed into exactly the sort of public spectacle Barbara Wilson would have done anything to avoid. With each new arrival, the story spread, how the HOA president had sold access to property she didn't control, how she had forged a signature, how the wedding venue didn't actually exist. As the chaos reached its peak, with Sarah sobbing, her mother demanding refunds, and Barbara trying desperately to regain control, Thomas quietly approached Michael Cooper, who had just arrived looking shell-shocked. Mr. Cooper, a word in private? Thomas led him away from the crowd toward the front porch. I want to be clear. My issue is with Barbara Wilson and the HOA, not with you and your fiancé. You're innocent victims in this situation. Michael ran a hand through his hair. What do you suggest we do? Sarah has been planning this for over a year. Thomas smiled slightly. I actually have a suggestion. I know the owner of Oakville Lodge. They had a cancellation for next Saturday, a corporate event that fell through. The venue is available, including their gardens and reception hall. Michael stared at him in disbelief. How do you know this? I made some calls when I realized this confrontation was inevitable, Thomas explained. I didn't want your wedding to be collateral damage in my dispute with the HOA. He handed Michael a business card with the lodge manager's contact information. They're expecting your call. And because they're as disgusted by Barbara's behavior as I am, they're offering a discount. Michael studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand. Thank you. This is unexpectedly kind of you. Thomas shook his hand. Consider it a wedding gift. And perhaps a reminder that not everyone in Oakville operates the way Barbara does. As Michael returned to Sarah with this potential solution, Thomas noticed Jack Thompson had joined the spectators, a broad grin splitting his weathered face as he gave a thumbs up from behind Barbara's back. The theatrical display had achieved exactly what Thomas had hoped. A public exposure of Barbara's methods that couldn't be swept under the rug or dismissed as a private dispute. The fallout was swift and far-reaching. By afternoon, local social media groups were buzzing with the story, complete with pictures of the portable toilets and pest control signs. Several other property owners came forward with similar stories of being pressured to join the historical venues program. The HOA board called an emergency meeting where Barbara faced uncomfortable questions about the program's finances. The booking fees, totaling nearly $45,000 over the past year, had been diverted to an administrative account that funded, among other things, renovations to the HOA clubhouse and an expensive board dinner. John Davidson called on Sunday, chuckling as he delivered the news. The HOA board has placed Barbara on leave pending an investigation, he reported. They're sending formal apologies to everyone involved in the historical venues program and offering full refunds. He paused before delivering the best news. And the city council, including Barbara's husband, has formally acknowledged that your property remains outside HOA jurisdiction, with no historical designation unless you choose to pursue one. Thomas smiled, picturing Barbara's husband distancing himself from her schemes to save his own political career. And Sarah's wedding? He asked. Relocated to Oakville Lodge with minimal drama, John replied. The lodge owner is apparently delighted with the last-minute booking and the publicity. He's even throwing in a free champagne toast for all guests. His voice grew more serious. You handled this brilliantly, Thomas. Your grandmother would have approved of both your backbone and your compassion for the innocent parties. Coming from someone who had known Rose Reed for decades, this was high praise indeed. On Monday morning, most of Thomas's theatrical props were removed. The portable toilets were collected and the pest control signs taken down. He kept the demolition equipment a bit longer, partly because he actually did want to make some landscape improvements, and partly as a visible reminder that he wasn't to be trifled with. As he was reviewing plans with the excavation foreman, a modest sedan pulled into the driveway. Mary Johnson, the HOA treasurer, emerged looking considerably less polished than she had at the confrontation. Mr. Reed, she called, approaching with visible discomfort. I owe you an apology. Thomas invited her onto the porch, where she declined his offer of coffee but seemed grateful to sit. I wanted you to know that most of the board had no idea Barbara was adding properties without permission, she began. We thought all the participants had voluntarily joined the program. When questions were raised about certain properties, Barbara assured us everything was properly documented. She twisted her hands in her lap. The forgery, that was entirely her doing, not a board action. And the money? Thomas asked. Were you aware of where the booking fees were going? Mary winced. We were told the funds were being held in escrow for property maintenance, minus administrative costs. It wasn't until yesterday's emergency meeting that we saw the actual accounts. She shook her head slowly. 90% was classified as administrative, with only 10% reserved for the properties themselves. And even that hadn't been distributed. She straightened her shoulders, meeting his eyes directly. I've resigned from the board. Several others have as well. We're recommending a complete restructuring of the HOA leadership, with proper checks and balances. Thomas nodded, appreciating her candor. What will happen to Barbara? Mary's expression hardened slightly. There's talk of criminal charges for the forgery and misappropriation of funds. At minimum, she's finished in Oakville. Her husband is facing questions about how much he knew, and her real estate license is under review. She stood to leave, then hesitated. Your grandmother was respected in this community, Mr. Reed. What Barbara did, using her property without permission, that wasn't right. I should have asked more questions. With that, she returned to her car, the first of several board members who would make similar visits of apology in the coming days. The following Saturday, as Sarah and Michael exchanged vows at Oakville Lodge surrounded by their guests, Thomas was in his grandmother's gardens, hands deep in rich soil as he planted new flowers. Jack Thompson had come out of retirement to help, bringing cuttings he'd preserved from Rose's original plants. You know, Jack said as they worked side by side, your grandmother always said gardens were a lesson in patience and consequence. Plant the right seeds, tend them properly, and eventually you reap the beauty you've sown. Same goes for dealing with people, I suppose. Thomas smiled, looking around at the property that had now been definitively secured from those who would exploit it. She was a wise woman, he agreed. And now everyone in Oakville understands that her grandson inherited more than just her land. Jack chuckled, his weathered face creasing with genuine amusement. Indeed they do. Between the portable toilets and the bulldozer, I'd say you made an impression that won't soon be forgotten. In the distance, they could see new signs being installed at the entrance to Oakville Heights, announcing the newly elected HOA board and their commitment to transparent, respectful community governance. As spring deepened into summer, the gardens began their slow transformation back to life. The old gazebo received a fresh coat of paint, the paths were cleared and restored, and the first roses bloomed in spectacular profusion. Barbara Wilson and her husband sold their Oakville Heights home and moved to Florida, their departure hastened by the legal consequences of her actions, a fine and community service for fraud and forgery. The Historical Venues program was disbanded, replaced by a voluntary historical registry with clear guidelines and transparent financial management. In a surprising twist, Sarah and Michael sent Thomas a thank you note and a bottle of champagne after their honeymoon. "Thanks for saving our wedding and exposing the truth," the card read. The lodge was perfect, and everyone agreed the drama made for a much better story than a typical ceremony. Enclosed was a wedding photo showing the happy couple in Oakville Lodge's gardens, looking not at all traumatized by their last-minute venue change. Thomas placed the picture on his mantle, a reminder that sometimes the path to justice takes unexpected turns. A year later, when the gardens had been fully restored and the house renovations completed, Thomas hosted a garden party for the neighbors, including many from Oakville Heights who had previously viewed his property with envy or resentment. Under twinkling lights strung through the old oak trees, with music playing softly and the scent of roses filling the evening air, even former HOA board members commented on how right it felt to see the Reed property restored to its former glory. "Your grandmother would be proud," Jack told him as they watched guests wandering the illuminated paths. "Not just of the gardens, but of how you protected her legacy." Thomas raised his glass in a silent toast to Rose Reed, whose strength of character had guided him even in her absence. In the end, the wedding that never happened had led to something far more meaningful, a true community gathering based on mutual respect rather than control or greed. And if the occasional bride approached him about hosting a legitimate, properly arranged wedding in these beautiful gardens, well, that would be entirely his choice, made with his full consent, and without a single portable toilet or bulldozer in sight.